Remember, electronic technicians, if you want a career, not just a job, there's a real future for you at DuMont.
Trade in your old television set. Trade it up to a DuMont.
BD DuMont in New York.
The Johns Hopkins Science Review, presented by the Johns Hopkins University and WAAM in Baltimore. This is the Johns Hopkins University, famed for 75 years for its contributions to science and the humanities. Here in its many laboratories, Hopkins scientists are constantly probing into the basic, still unknown facts of science, which, when discovered, are translated into benefits to be enjoyed by you, the people of America. Each week, we glance over the shoulders of these scientists and catch a glimpse of their research. And this week, we see the results of the work of many scientists when we learn how a television picture travels from studio to your home. And to introduce this week's guest, here is Lynn Poole of the Johns Hopkins University.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Johns Hopkins Science Review. Those of you that were with us last week know that we took you on a tour of the studio and showed you how the Johns Hopkins Science Review is produced. This week, we'd like to continue the story and tell you how a television program goes from a studio and a station to your home, whether your home be here in Baltimore or out in Los Angeles. This pipe that I was looking at when you came in is a telephone cable, a local telephone cable. It has 4,200 wires in it, and it's capable of carrying 2,100 telephone conversations. Now, tonight we'd like to show you another cable. That's the coaxial cable that could carry 3 times the number of telephone conversations that you see on this local cable. There are 109 television stations in this country using coaxial cable and microwave relays. These stations are in 67 cities. Now, for instance, in New York City, in a television studio, a camera is taking pictures of people giving a program. And this program is being carried clear across the country, from coast to coast, from east to west, and is being seen by people in their homes in Los Angeles. Now, this seems like almost a miraculous thing. Well, how does it happen? How does it come about that television programs go clear across the country from one ocean to the other? Well, our guest tonight is a man who knows, who can tell us how this happens, and it gives me great pleasure to present Dr. M.E. Strebe, Director of Demonstrations for the American Telephone and Telegraph Company.
Television broadcasting is different from ordinary broadcasting because on your television set at home, you can't receive programs from stations that are much beyond the horizon. Therefore, it's necessary to provide some means of carrying television programs from city to city. The Bell telephone companies are arranging to do just that, in the same way that we have for many years carried radio programs. And we have 2 methods of doing this. The first method used was coaxial cable. And I'm sure you've all heard about coaxial cable, but I suspect maybe you never saw one. This is a piece of the actual coaxial cable that is used to connect New York to Baltimore, Washington, and many other places in the country. And the reason it's called a coaxial cable is because in the center of it there are 8 copper pipes, each of which we call coaxial conductors. Now I'm going to show you one of those in more detail so you can get an idea of just why we call it coaxial and what it does. This copper pipe on the outside is a little larger in diameter than a pencil. The copper wire runs down the middle, is a little larger than the lead in a pencil. And the wire runs down the same axis as the cable. That's why we call it coaxial. And the wire is supported by little thin insulating discs about an inch apart along the cable. And inside the pipe is mostly air. And the way we use this peculiar structure is to send radio signals through that airspace between the wire and the pipe. Radio signals that we send are the same kind that you have on your ordinary radio set at home. So this is really a private section of the ether that we use for radio signals. These signals can't get out, no one can hear what goes on inside, and we're not subjected to interference from static or other noises inside this radio pipe. But these radio signals are used to carry mostly telephone calls. That's what we built it for. In fact, 600 simultaneous telephone talkers' voices can be carried inside this single coaxial pipe. And of course we use it for telegraph and for other purposes, including television. But when we send television, it takes the whole capacity of one of these pipes to carry one television program. Now, the radio signals that go through this pipe don't go as well as if they're out in free space. They're cramped inside the pipe. They get attenuated, and so we have to provide boosters. And I have a booster here, which you can see. It's a pretty fancy sort of a radio set. And these are put in each of these coaxial pipes every 8 miles to boost the signal and make it stronger and keep it free from distortion as it goes across the country. Because on long circuits, there may be hundreds of these amplifiers in tandem, and so they have to be very accurately constructed. One very interesting thing about that booster amplifier is the special radio tube that was developed in Bell Laboratories before the war to accomplish that purpose, because there was no radio tube that would do that job. And it was a lucky thing that was developed before the war, because the need for that tube turned out to be great. It was packaged in a little smaller housing, coded the 6AK5, and was used by the dozen in every radar set that was built during the war and in many other electronic devices. It's even in our television cameras here today. Well, the reason we have so much coaxial cable is that it's the most economical means we have of providing large numbers of long-distance cable circuits. Today we have about 50,000 miles of copper pipe like this buried between the major cities of this country. And on those pipes we're carrying some 3.5 million miles of long-distance telephone circuit and about 8,000 miles of network television circuit.
As Dr. Strebe has told you, this wonderful coaxial cable, only about so big, that streams across thousands of miles, does carry television programs from city to city. But this was not the ideal solution for carrying television programs to your home and across the country. So in 1947, a second method was devised. And this second method is known as radio relay. And I'd like to ask Dr. Strebe if he'll tell us about that right now.
The idea of radio relay is very simple. You have a radio transmitter on a tower, such as this, with a special antenna here that I'll tell you about later, which beams the signal to another tower, maybe 25 or 35 miles away. In this tower, there's a booster amplifier, much like the coaxial booster, which increases the strength of the signal, and it's again retransmitted from this tower to another. And so on with jumps of 25 or 35 miles, we go from city to city. The transcontinental radio relay system, which we completed late last summer, takes 108 such jumps to go from New York to San Francisco. It sounds very simple. It would be simple if we had a good space in the radio spectrum in which to accommodate these complicated signals that carry so much information. To find space in the radio for them, we had to go to the region known as the microwave radio region. And that sounds a bit technical, doesn't it? So I'm going to take a minute off to explain to you what we mean by wavelength of microwaves. You're all familiar with waves on the water. So let's start with a picture of what the ocean looks like during a storm. And there are mountainous waves, one following another. Now the engineers always refer to waves in radio in terms of their wavelength. And by that they mean the distance from the crest of one wave to the crest of the next. And while that may be a long distance on the ocean for water, water can also have shorter wavelengths. If there's a puddle on the sidewalk and the wind is blowing across the puddle, there may be little ripples on that puddle. And the wavelength in that case from the crest of one wave to the crest of the next may only be an inch or so. So even in water, we have different wavelengths. Now when it comes to radio, you can't see the waves, you can't feel them, but the engineers can measure something there. And what they measure is a voltage. And what they find is that at some points in space, there's a relatively high voltage, at others there's low voltage or none at all, and then further along there'll be high voltage again. And so they define the wavelength of radio waves as the distance from one high voltage point to the next. And for ordinary broadcast frequencies, such as you listen to on your radio set, that wavelength may be a quarter of a mile. For television broadcasting, the wavelength is much shorter. It may be only 5 or 10 or 20 feet from the crest of one wave to another. So during the war, when the engineers developed even shorter wavelengths, they called them microwaves. And the actual wavelengths that they developed at that time were no longer than a cigarette, about 3 inches. But I never cared very much for calling that short a length microwave, because you and I are all very much more familiar with radio waves that are very, very much shorter. Light waves, the light from the sun or from an electric lamp that your eye can see is a radio wave. It's exactly the same kind of a wave that you pick up on your television set or on your radio set, except that the wavelength is very different. And in the case of light, the wavelength is so short you have to use a microscope to see it. There are 100,000 wavelengths of light in the length of a cigarette. So in explaining about microwaves, I thought we might best start with light, because there are so many things about light that you and I are very familiar with. For example, if I turn this flashlight right into your eyes, you can see it quite brightly. But no one else can see just how bright it is except the person that I'm pointing this at. That's because light travels in very straight lines. Now, another thing about light that you're all extremely familiar with is that a mirror reflects light very easily. And I can shine this right into the camera, right into your eye from a small mirror. In this modern age, when we use so many plastics, you're familiar with the fact that light will go right through plexiglass or other plastics. But maybe you didn't know that if I could get the light to go inside this plastic, I can make it turn around a corner. And instead of shooting straight out, I can make it bend and go around a corner. The reason for that is that the light finds it smooth on the inside of this plexiglass bar and is reflected so that it comes out the end of the bar. Now, light can also be used for signaling purposes. In fact, it is so used was when I was in the Signal Corps. We had to learn to use a heliograph. But I have a little flashlight bulb here that gives me a beam of light, and I'm going to pick it up over here on a photoelectric cell, an electric eye. I believe you heard about a magic eye on this program not so long ago. This is the same sort of a thing, except this is a modern version developed by the Bell Laboratories, and it's called a phototransistor. It does the same job, except it's about 100 times as efficient. Now the output of that photoelectric cell is an electric signal. And so I'm going to connect it onto the loudspeaker here. And I'm going to interrupt this little beam of light in such a way that when it's interrupted, you'll hear a little bump on the loudspeaker. Let's see if you can see this tiny little spot of light that I'm talking about. It's right here on this screen. And when I interrupt it, you can hear a bump. That's the way I'm signaling. The engineer would say I was modulating this signal, but that's just a Phi Beta Kappa word for changing it or cutting it out. And I can modulate it faster with my fingers. Or if I take a comb, I can do it a whole lot faster. You see, if I were a musician, I perhaps could play you a tune. But not being a musician, I've got a phonograph over here. And instead of using that phonograph to do something in front of my receiving tube, I'm going to modulate the amount of light in this transmitter. Because, you know, a phonograph like this puts out a little electric voltage. And I'm going to superimpose that voltage on the voltage that lights this light. And the light will get brighter and dimmer very, very fast, just in accordance with the signal that comes from that phonograph. And so that will enable us to transmit the music from that phonograph record through into our loudspeaker. And let's see if it works. Did I say music? Well, at any rate, we're getting something from the phonograph, and I can interrupt it because it's just on that spot of light.
Calling you. Just for your...
Well, so much for the way we can modulate a light beam and transmit intelligence over a light beam at frequencies of light, these tiny microscopic wavelengths. So let's move from there now and talk about frequencies in the microwave region, those in the range of the length of a cigarette that we're talking about. And I have here a generator of electromagnetic waves of about that length, and it's connected up to be modulated by that same phonograph. And I'm going to receive that signal on a little crystal detector here of the modern variety. It's the same sort of a thing years ago we called a cat's whisker, and some of us built radio sets. The only reason for having a horn of this kind in front is to pick up a little extra signal, just the way an ear trumpet is used to enable a person to hear better if their hearing is impaired. And the same way on the sending end, I have a horn which serves to direct the signals out in more or less of a beam. The same as a cheerleader in the football field will use a megaphone to throw his voice. Now to see if we're getting some transmission across here, I will connect up again to the loudspeaker. And of course you can't see anything coming out here. I can't feel anything, so we'll have to experiment a little and see what's happening. Let's try this.
Back and try me once more.
The same so-called music. And of course I can interrupt it with this sheet of metal as I did before. But let's make a couple of other experiments with this now. For example, you know that radio goes through the walls of your house perfectly well. So I have here a piece of plywood. And let's see how microwaves compare with ordinary radio in going through the walls of your house.
Yes, I know.
There's no problem at all. It goes right through. Let's experiment a little further and try a piece of rabbit wire. With light, of course, goes through it. Let's see how about microwaves.
Mercy on this heart of mine.
Still no problem. Well, let's go a step further. I have here a piece of mosquito netting, metal mosquito netting. Again, you notice the light goes right through it. Let's see if the microwaves will go through it. Ah, now we've gotten down to a point where these waves won't go through. Notice that I can interrupt the beam anywhere I want, and the waves won't go through. Now I'd like to make a couple of other experiments to show you some of the analogies with light. For example, you remember one of the first things I did was to remind you that light was easy to reflect from a surface that was smooth at the wavelengths of light. Let's try reflecting the microwaves. My receiver in this position won't pick them up, but I'll reflect them. Or sideways. It's very easy. As a matter of fact, that's one of the troubles we have with microwaves, is they get reflected too easily. Now, you remember the light would go around the corner of this plexiglass. Let's see what we can do with microwaves. Because you remember when I had my receiver up here before, nothing happened. Perfectly easy. Now let me try another experiment with what we call a flexible waveguide. This is a pipe sometimes used for transmitting gasoline or other liquids. Obviously, light won't go through a crooked pipe of this kind, but let's try the microwave.
Yes, I can try one more time.
It's very easy to go around any kind of a corner you want. Now, one other thing that I want to remind you and tell you about is how these waves are polarized. You know that from your physics that light may be either polarized in a vertical direction or in a horizontal direction. Now this happens to be a transmitter that produces vertical polarization. And I have another one here just like it on the same frequency, but I'm going to turn it on its side. So that's going to produce horizontal polarization, and I'm going to drive it with a different phonograph. Now let's see how fouled up we've gotten here. I've got one transmitter vertically polarized from one phonograph, the other one horizontally polarized from another phonograph, and I'm going to try to pick the whole thing up right here.
Yeah, for my darling, great heroes, have to be shaken, or you're leaving it to me, to the victor.
So with this, you see, I can get two paths of transmission, one vertically polarized and one horizontally polarized, and two separate programs. But you know, in that connection, you might be amused to know that we have made a little laboratory device to save ourselves the trouble of turning this receiver first one way and the other, and I'll show you how it works. I have called it an electromagnetic monkey wrench, and this is what it consists of. And what I can do with it is to twist this beam instead of twisting the receiver, and I want to show you how it works. So you see, it really saves a lot of trouble, but as far as I'm concerned, this really has absolutely no practical value. But now, turning to practical values, I want to tell you how we use these microwaves in our systems. And with the aid of the first chart, I'd like to show you the kind of lens that we use in this microwave system. This lens is about 10 feet square, it weighs about a ton, and is very accurately machined out of metal. That lens is mounted in front of a horn, which I'll show you on the next diagram. The horn is also about 10 feet square, and these are mounted on telephone buildings all over the country. I'm sure many of you have seen them. That produces such a sharp beam of radio waves, sharper than the best searchlight. So sharp, in fact, that we can concentrate the energy and deliver 10,000 times as much power at the receiving station as if we used an ordinary radio antenna. Now these horns are mounted on top of high towers so we can get clear line of sight from one tower to the next. I'll show you a typical metal tower of the type that we use out in the western states and are starting to use now in many of the southern states. These towers are generally about 200 feet high. They carry on top 4 of these horns, one transmitting east, one receiving from the east, one transmitting west, and one receiving from the west. Let me show you another type of tower that we have used between New York and Chicago. It's made of concrete, but the same sort of an arrangement. And when we get out to the mountainous regions out in Nevada, we have mounted some of them on the high mountains. And I'll show you one at Mount Rose, Nevada, at an altitude of some 10,000 feet. There we saved money by not building a high tower, but of course we had to build a road up the mountain. Now to end up, let's show a map of where we now have network facilities. Networks started, of course, in the east, and you all remember that last summer we completed the final link from Omaha through to San Francisco in time to bring you the proceedings of the Peace Conference on September 4th. Today we have in service some 22,000 miles of facilities suitable for handling television network programs, and we're building more. The biggest job this year will be to go down into the Texas area and into New Orleans and Miami, and we intend to provide more when the broadcasters need it.
And here we have the 2 ways that television programs go from city to city and across country. Here in the coaxial cable that you saw a few moments ago, a television program, both sound and picture, traveling through this cable for thousands of miles around the United States and from coast to coast. The relay towers that carry it from one to the other across the country. You saw some of them built high, hundreds of feet high, and others placed on tops of mountains, in order that programs may span this entire United States from coast to coast. And as Dr. Strebe says, before long, many other cities will be serviced with the microwave relay, and probably some of them with the coaxial cable that you see here. We hope that you've enjoyed this demonstration and very much hope that you'll be with us next week when the Johns Hopkins Science Review presents a different type of program to show you that a hospital never sleeps.
Hospitals all over the country, large and small, are active 24 hours each day. A hospital never sleeps. Nurses and doctors must care for the sick who are restless at night. They must be on hand to care for emergencies such as accident cases rushed to the hospitals. Doctors must be ready to bring new life into this world at any time of the day or night. But back of the ever-wakeful professional men and women stand many other men and women who keep the hospital running, make it possible for the doctors and nurses to serve humanity. Be with us next week when we will visit the famed Johns Hopkins Hospital as we stand by and watch the activity which will show us why a hospital never sleeps. The Johns Hopkins Science Review is produced by Lynn Poole, directed by Paul Kane. Associate producer is Robert Fenwick. Associate director, Ed Serro. Art direction is by Barry Mansfield. Your narrator has been Joel Chaseman.
Portions of this program were mechanically reproduced. The Johns Hopkins Science Review.
This is the DuMont Television Network. Time now for Wrestling from Columbia Park with Dennis J. Sure to stay tuned. Kevin program for 1952 meet the challenge of the Republican Party. How much of the program will